want to get to some reaction here because joining me now, we have Henrietta Treyz, Veda Partners Managing Partner and Director of Economic Policy, Terry Haines, Pangaea Policy Founder, as well as Michael Goosay, Principal Asset Management Chief Investment Officer of Global Fixed Income. Henrietta, let's start with you. As I said, the markets seem to be somewhat relieved that the president's rhetoric on Greenland was not more forceful. I'm curious what you think, whether this did represent a step down.
Yeah, I think the market is right to respond to this as the taco moment. The president has the ability to put tariffs on. But one of the things I think is underappreciated is that yesterday, that authority to impose tariffs was almost stripped away by the Supreme Court. And that could happen again at the end of next month. So the president is building up new and different ways to justify tariffs against the EU, the UK, and other nations, and now is incorporating Greenland into that conversation. And really importantly, it must be made transparent that the president does not have trade deals with either the EU or the UK. We have, outlines of a plan, but there's no deal. And now planned tariff reductions are not going to happen on the EU's part. They were going to take their industrial tariffs on the US down to zero later on this week, and that's not going to happen. And the bottom line is that all these deals and negotiations that the president likes to speak to have not concluded. And now we're layering on Greenland, which is a very important topic, but also importantly a distraction from the fact that those tariff authorities are about to be stripped and that we don't have deals with either the EU or the UK.
And Terry, I think it's interesting when the president talks about how economically things have turned out better than a lot of the forecasts, right? Even with the tariffs in place. It's worth remembering the worst case tariffs are not in fact in place, right? That he introduced on Liberation Day. I mean, how do you think this pitch plays, not just there in the room at Davos, where it probably doesn't play great, but with the American people?
Well, on one level, it's greatest hits for an American audience, right. But it's it's not greatest hits for a European audience. And I think there's 3 points underlying that speech. First is that, as Lutnick wrote in the Financial Times yesterday, they went there to confront the status quo, not defend it. So they're certainly doing that. The second is a direct challenge that the Davos man has failed here, and we're going to do something different now. And thirdly, that part of what we're doing differently is taking national security a whole lot more seriously, and international security. Trump is quick to say, a whole lot more seriously than States administrations have done or European administrations have done. It's not for nothing he mentions the lack of European support for NATO over the past decade plus.
Yes, although he also said he didn't think NATO would come to the U.S. aid if it was called upon, and of course it did in the wake of 9/11, but he chose to not remember that particular item. Mike, I want to get to you because the bond market action yesterday in particular, as our Jared Blickery, our markets editor, pointed out, taco, or Trump always chickens out, the president has been more reactive in this term to the bond market than to the stock market. What did you think of the action yesterday? How much of it was Japan versus Greenland, and what happens now?
Yeah, thank you. I think there was a lot to parse in this speech today, but what stood out to me is he spent a lot of time talking about housing. Housing is very dependent on levels of interest rates, whether those are Fed fund rates or longer term interest rates. And so to your point, he has become more focused on bonds in this term versus the equity market, which was a lot of the conversations in his first term and even early on in this one. The bond market is concerned. The bond market's concerned for multiple reasons. I do think yesterday's price action was largely driven off of the Japan concerns, fiscal concerns, whether that's additional stimulus or inflation risks or just a mismanagement of the way that bond market operates. But the overall concerns in the bond market are real today. There's obvious additional stimulus. You heard some intonations of that today in order to stimulate growth, in order to make housing more affordable. That do worry the bond market because they are largely inflationary risks that could push long-term interest rates higher.
And I should mention, by the way, on the housing front, there's more reason for pessimism there today because we just got U.S. pending home sales, which were down 9.3%, which was the biggest drop since 2020 with those pending home sales numbers. And that's the number for December, by the way. Michael, I was struck when the president was doing the Q&A and he was asked about U.S. debt. He basically said the strategy is to try and grow our way out of it. So, in other words, he didn't say we're going to cut spending, or he didn't give the sort of priority to cutting spending. He talked about growing his way out of it. Is the bond market confident in that strategy?
It's hard to really cut spending to a large enough degree to be able to truly impact the deficit. So the right answer is to try to grow at an above trend rate, which would allow additional revenues to come into the government coffers and ultimately result in the ability, if you didn't spend it, to pay down debt and to reduce the overall deficit of the country. So it's not surprising that he would say that. The biggest issue with the bond market about the debt or deficit is, as long as somebody's willing to lend money to the U.S. government, which seems to be the case, both domestic investors as well as international investors continue to buy treasuries and corporate bonds, then it's not an issue. It's when those investors strike and get concerned about either the quality of the debt or the value of the future dollar that they're putting in the market today at current interest rates, that you'll actually see the real spike and that's what you saw in Japan, is that concern playing out with long-term interest rates spiking so quickly and so rapidly.
So Henrietta, I want to go back to you because there's also the matter of how much we would pay for Greenland, I guess, if we did end up buying it and what that would do to the whole debt picture. But I also want to come back to the issue of, yes, I know this was the international stage. The president was not explicitly speaking to the U.S. people. And as Terry said, this was sort of a greatest hits outside of the Greenland discussions. But, the president saying his approval ratings are great is not the case. The approval ratings are not great right now. And so with him focusing on Greenland or Venezuela or what have you, what do you think the kind of ripple effect is?
Yeah, roughly 1% of Americans think foreign policy should be the president's main focus. The vast majority of Americans believe that inflation, prices, the economy, and jobs are the foremost areas of concern for them, and that's what they'll be voting on. The president is 25 points underwater in his handling of the U.S. economy. That's a death knell, both for the president and down ballot for Republicans going into the midterm cycle. So when the president speaks to Greenland, it should have the effect of boosting foreign policy. It's just a general thing that's in the ether in the American public, but we are famously ambivalent about foreign policy here in the United States. It's not what voters go to the mat for. And that's the reality that the president and the Republicans are facing down ballot, and why we're forecasting about 25 seats in the House will flip to Democratic control next year.
Do you think, Terry, that the president made a convincing case to the American people that Greenland is necessary for the U.S.?
I think they make a case that a pretty good case that it's essential to U.S. national security, and that's been pretty obvious for a while. You got to separate the signal from the noise on all this stuff. The signal is what markets might be reacting to, or certainly the press is this morning, that Trump won't use force with Greenland. The signal is that the United States is not going to back down from increasing the U.S. security perimeter and get greater access to Greenland minerals. And the president's not going to be swayed by the polls of the moment on doing that or doing the economic.
Terry, I apologize for interrupting. If that's the case, if that's the real signal that the president was sending, should the market be relieved then? Or should the if indeed we are going to see a more belligerent, for lack of a better word, United States, does that mean that it's sort of all clear for markets?
I don't think the markets, I think, are not reacting so much to Greenland as the idea that there might be a bigger reason why the United States has its hair on fire about national security. And that's been building for a while. The Trump people have been trying to, both shore up United States national security and not alarm markets too much about this. But there has been the highest geopolitical risk in over 50 years, and that's been going on arguably since the Ukraine aggression 4 years ago, and made worse by what's going on in the South China Sea, the Middle Middle East and all the rest. Markets have brushed that off. The last time they had a shudder about this, that it might not be going away, was in the middle of the summer with Iran, and it might be back to some extent. So there's that. Beyond that, Trump's not going to be dissuaded because everything's compared to something else, and Trump at this point is roughly as popular as Bush 43 or Obama were in their second terms. And he's by far more popular than either Republicans or especially Democrats, who are like 25 points underwater right now. So, the bottom line here is that they're not going to be dissuaded by polls of the moment, and the fundamental foreign policy, which includes tariffs, is not going to be dissuaded either. They're going to continue on with this, whether anybody particularly likes it or not.
Terry, Henrietta, Michael, thanks very much. And thanks for sticking around through the speech and giving us your reaction. We appreciate it. And let's now get some more reaction from on the ground in Davos. Steve Clemons is there. He's the national interest editor at large. Steve, thanks to you as well for sticking around through that speech. So as someone who is there and who is talking to people in Davos, ahead of this speech, I'm sure you were talking to a lot of folks. What do you think the sort of conversation is going to be like now that the speech has been delivered?
So, look, I want to be respectful of President Trump, but the speech, given the anxiety, was sort of a dud. People were thinking worst case scenarios. I mean, the anxiety levels in Davos have been through the roof. And of course, there's a giant delegation coming with President Trump that's been here. I mean, Scott Besant's been here since Monday. Marco Rubio just got here. You've got other people. Howard Lutnick I saw last night. You have interesting people, Mehmet Oz. He brought so many people, giant U.S. delegation. And people just thought this was going to be a big American statement on something, leaving NATO, hyper-nationalism. He had some tough love for Europe in his speech, but really before this, this speech happened, we were warned by folks around the U.S. delegation, clear our schedules for Wednesday afternoon. President Trump is going to do something so big that it will take away our whole afternoon. And that clearly didn't happen. I mean, he basically calmed the markets, calmed the temperature on Greenland, saying he's not going to take it by force. And, he didn't really diverge from something. There was nothing big, nothing new. And this was a kinder, gentler version of Donald Trump than was expected by the street here in Davos, if you can call it that.
So what do you think the speech achieved, Steve? Was it just a matter of sort of, as we have seen, by the way, in this playbook many times before, sort of whipping up that hysteria and then stepping in and saying, well, it's not going to be that worst case scenario?
Well, look, I think the truth is every president, not just Donald Trump, every presidency is a schizophrenic exercise with dominant personalities or dominant forms, competing with subordinate forms, and they take turns. Just because we saw a calmer Donald Trump that's here and so far has been largely pleasant, even in delivering his tough love about what he sees as America's need, a national security need to have Greenland, and that we deserved it, that he wasn't going to use force. This is, I think this, the European community is breathing a sigh of relief for a moment, but they don't know whether to trust this direction because they're used to flip-flops. Nigel Farage is here, who's head of the UK Reform Party, and there was a rumor that Nigel Farage and Donald Trump were going to come together, do something big around, populists of the world unite, etc. But that hasn't happened, at least yet. And I sort of think it is interesting that Donald Trump is, by keeping his powder more dry in this case, it may be available down the road. And it kind of keeps everybody on their toes guessing. And so as you just, indicated, Julie, the markets seem to be, relieved a little bit. But I think overall, there's a kind of ongoing simmering anxiety about where America's going, whether the transatlantic relationship is solvent, whether NATO means anything anymore. All of that is still percolating here in Davos.
Is there a Danish contingent there, Steve? And have they been speaking up?
The Danish have been speaking up, and everybody around them, Finland, Norway. I mean, and frankly, all of Europe. I mean, President Macron and others have been doing this. But I have happened to see I've been with the Danes, the Finns, the Swedes, etc. It comes up everywhere, and I haven't seen them since the speech, right? So I'm in my apartment here right now in Davos, so I haven't been out on the street since then. But the I would call it the decibel level of concern in these nations has been extremely high, like off the roof. And it has come up everywhere, over and over and over again. And I think almost an expectation that Donald Trump wasn't going to back off or yield. But President Trump continues to sort of surprise people, whether he's moving up the tempo or dialing it down. So there, again, I think talking to Denmark and representatives of Denmark and everything around that neighborhood in Northern Europe has been one where it was creating a lot of interesting questions about what the social contract is of security is among allies in NATO. And if this really got pushed, what would they do? That's what we've all been talking about.